Once upon a time, in a small town in Russia, there lived a family whose story began not with happiness, but with the quiet hope that understanding might one day come. The father of this family was named Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov. He was not a good man in the way we usually think of goodness. He loved money and pleasure more than he loved his children. But even difficult people have stories worth knowing, for in understanding them, we learn something about the world and about ourselves. Fyodor had been married twice. His first wife was a gentle, wealthy woman who gave him a son named Dmitri. When she passed away, young Dmitri was left in the care of relatives and servants, growing up far from his father's house. His second wife, a quiet and troubled soul, gave him two more sons, Ivan and Alexei, before she too departed from this world. These boys, like their older brother, were raised by others, scattered like seeds on the wind. Years passed in this way, with the father living his chaotic life and the sons growing up apart, each becoming his own person in distant places. But our story truly begins when these grown sons, now young men, found their way back to their father's town. It was time, perhaps, for the family to finally meet as adults and see what they might become together. The eldest, Dmitri, had grown into a passionate man, full of fierce emotions that burned like fire. He laughed loudly, loved deeply, and felt everything with an intensity that both blessed and troubled him. He had served in the military and had developed a taste for life's pleasures, much like his father, though his heart held more honor than Fyodor's ever had. The middle son, Ivan, had become a scholar and a thinker. His mind was sharp and questioning, always searching for truth and meaning in a world that often seemed senseless. He wrote articles and thought deeply about God, morality, and human nature. Where Dmitri felt everything, Ivan thought everything, turning ideas over and over in his brilliant, restless mind. And then there was the youngest, Alexei, whom everyone called Alyosha. He was different from his brothers. Soft-spoken and gentle, Alyosha had a quality about him that made people feel peaceful in his presence. While still a young man, he had chosen to become a novice at the local monastery, studying under a beloved elder named Zosima. People said that Alyosha had a pure heart, and even in that troubled family, he seemed to carry light. The monastery where Alyosha lived was a place of quietness and prayer. The monks rose early, their voices joining in ancient chants as the sun painted the sky with soft colors. They tended gardens, copied manuscripts, and sought to live simply, turning away from the noise of the world. At the center of this peaceful life was Father Zosima, an old monk whose wisdom drew visitors from far and wide. He was growing frail now, but his eyes still sparkled with kindness, and his words carried the weight of a life fully lived. Father Zosima had grown fond of young Alyosha. He saw in the boy not just goodness, but strength, the kind of quiet strength that could endure sorrow and still choose love. The elder knew that Alyosha belonged not hidden away in a monastery, but out in the world, where his gentle spirit could touch those who needed it most. One day, a meeting was arranged at the monastery, a meeting that would bring the scattered family together. There was a dispute, you see, between father and eldest son over money and over a woman they both desired. It was an ugly situation, full of pride and anger. Father Zosima agreed to meet with them, hoping that his presence might bring some peace to their troubled hearts. They gathered in the elders' cell, Fyodor with his mocking smile, Dmitri with his barely contained rage, Ivan with his cool observation, and Alyosha with his quiet concern. The father made jokes and behaved foolishly, almost as if he couldn't help himself. Dmitri seethed with anger at his father's behavior. Ivan watched it all with the distance of someone studying an interesting problem. But Father Zosima saw through the chaos. He saw the pain beneath Fyodor's clowning, the desperation beneath Dmitri's rage, the loneliness beneath Ivan's intellect. And in a surprising moment, the old elder rose from his seat and bowed down before Dmitri, touching his forehead to the ground. No one understood why. It was a gesture of profound respect, almost like a prophecy, though the elder offered no explanation. He simply looked at them all with infinite compassion, as if he could see the suffering that lay ahead and wanted them to know they were not alone in it. After the meeting, life continued in its complicated way. Dmitri struggled with his passion for a beautiful woman named Grushenka, even as he was engaged to another. His relationship with his father grew more bitter, as both men wanted the same thing. Ivan wrestled with his doubts about God and morality, writing and thinking and trying to make sense of existence. And Alyosha moved between them all like a gentle breeze, loving each of them, trying to understand, hoping to help. In quiet moments, Alyosha would sit with Father Zosima, and the old monk would share his wisdom. He spoke of how everyone is responsible for everyone else, how we are all connected like threads in a great tapestry. He taught that even when we cannot understand why suffering exists, we can choose to respond with love. He reminded Alyosha that judgment belongs to God alone, and that our task is simply to love, forgive, and remain present to one another. These teachings settled into Alyosha's heart like seeds in good soil. He knew that his family was troubled, that storms were gathering on the horizon. But he also knew that love was stronger than chaos, that understanding was more powerful than judgment, and that even in the darkest night, morning would eventually come. As evening fell over the monastery, the bells would ring for vespers, their sound floating across the town like a reminder of something eternal. Alyosha would stand at the window of his cell, looking out at the fading light, thinking of his brothers and his father, holding them all in his prayers. The story of the Karamazov family was just beginning, full of passion and questions, mistakes and seeking. But on this quiet evening, as the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky, there was peace in the monastery. Father Zosima rested in his cell, Alyosha knelt in prayer, and somewhere in the distance, the troubled family slept, each dreaming their own dreams. And in that moment of quietness, before all the struggles that would come, there was simply the gentle breath of night, the whisper of prayer, and the hope that love, in the end, would prove stronger than all the forces that sought to tear them apart. The morning arrived soft and golden over the monastery, painting the white walls with gentle light. It was a day that held both promise and worry, for the Karamazov family would gather once more in the presence of the wise Father Zosima. Perhaps, People whispered hopefully, the holy elder could bring peace to this troubled family. Young Alyosha rose early, as was his custom. He had spent the night in prayer and reflection, thinking of his father and brothers, holding each of them in his heart. He knew them all so well now, their strengths and their sorrows, their hopes and their wounds. And he loved them, even when loving them was difficult. Father Zosima had also risen before dawn. The old monk moved slowly now, his body growing weaker with each passing day, but his spirit remained bright as starlight. He sat by his window, watching the sun climb higher, and thought about the family he would see today. He had already perceived something in them during their first meeting, a great suffering that was approaching, a storm on the horizon. But he also saw the possibility of redemption, of transformation, if only they could find their way through the darkness. Alyosha, the elder called gently, and the young novice came to sit beside him. They spoke quietly together about love and forgiveness, about how the human heart can hold both terrible pain and tremendous grace. Father Zosima reminded Alyosha that even when people behave badly, they are often crying out from their deepest wounds, seeking something they cannot name. "Remember, my dear boy," the elder said, his weathered hand resting on Alyosha's shoulder, "that everyone, no matter how they appear, is carrying a burden you cannot see. Your father, with all his foolishness, he is suffering. Your brother Dmitri, with all his rage, he is suffering. Even Ivan, with all his brilliant thoughts, he too is suffering. Your task is not to judge them, but to love them." Alyosha nodded, taking these words into his heart like precious seeds. As the appointed hour approached, visitors began to arrive at the monastery. The monks moved quietly through the corridors, preparing the elder's cell for the gathering. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, though whether it was hopeful or anxious, no one could quite say. Fyodor Pavlovitch arrived first, dressed extravagantly, making grand gestures and loud pronouncements as he entered. He seemed determined to turn everything into a performance, as if by making people laugh at him, he could somehow protect himself from being truly seen. He joked with the monks, made irreverent comments, and generally behaved as though he were at a party rather than a monastery. But those who looked closely could see something desperate in his eyes, something lonely and afraid beneath all the bluster. Dmitri came next, arriving late and breathless, his face flushed with emotion. He had been detained by some urgent matter, perhaps another confrontation with his father over money, or perhaps a passionate encounter with the woman he loved. Everything about Dmitri was intense and immediate. He lived each moment as if it might be his last, feeling everything with a depth that both elevated and tormented him. Ivan arrived with a quiet dignity, observing everything with his sharp, analytical gaze. He had brought along a strange companion, a man named Smerdyakov, who was actually Fyodor's servant and, though it was whispered rather than spoken, possibly his illegitimate son. Smerdyakov had a peculiar manner about him, servile yet somehow contemptuous, speaking in careful, measured tones that seemed to mock even as they obeyed. There were others too who had come to see the famous elder. Landladies seeking his blessing, a monk named Father Therapon who disapproved of Zosima's gentle approach to faith, and a wealthy woman named Madame Koklakov with her daughter Lise, who was confined to a wheelchair but whose eyes sparkled with intelligence and barely concealed mischief. They all gathered in Father Zosima's cell, a simple room made sacred not by ornate decorations but by the presence of a man who had devoted his life to understanding and compassion. The elder sat in his chair, his aged face serene, and welcomed each person with genuine warmth. What followed was both painful and profound. Fyodor Pavlovitch, unable to contain himself, began to play the fool more outrageously than ever. He told inappropriate jokes, made mockery of sacred things, and seemed intent on causing maximum embarrassment. It was as if he were testing everyone present, testing to see if they would reject him, confirming his deepest fear that he was indeed unlovable and unworthy. "Why do I do these things?" he suddenly cried out in the midst of his performance. "Why do I always play the fool?" For just a moment, the mask slipped, and everyone could see the genuine anguish beneath. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vulnerability vanished, replaced once more by his grinning, mocking face. Dmitri tried to maintain his composure, but his father's behavior pushed him to the edge of rage. The tension between father and son filled the room like a gathering storm. They had such grievances between them: money that Dmitri believed was rightfully his from his mother's estate, money that his father refused to give him. And deeper than the money, there was the woman they both desired, Grushenka, whose beauty and mysterious nature had captivated them both. "You owe me," Dmitri finally burst out, unable to contain himself any longer. "You've cheated me, kept what was mine, and now you dare to compete with me for—" He stopped himself, breathing heavily, his fists clenched. Father Zosima watched it all with infinite patience. He did not scold or lecture. He simply observed, holding space for all their pain and confusion, creating a refuge where even the most difficult truths could be spoken. When Dmitri had finished his outburst, the elder spoke gently about the nature of family bonds, about how the debts we owe each other are both simpler and more complex than money. He spoke of forgiveness not as a single act but as a way of living, a choice we make again and again, especially when it seems impossible. Then there was Ivan, the intellectual, who had been watching everything with his characteristic detachment. The elder turned to him and said, "You are tormented by a great question, are you not? The question of whether God exists, and if he does, whether the world he has created can be justified." Ivan was startled that the elder had perceived this so clearly. He admitted that yes, he struggled with these questions constantly. How could a good God allow innocent children to suffer? How could faith be possible in a world so full of cruelty and injustice? Father Zosima listened to Ivan's doubts with respect, not dismissing them as mere intellectual vanity. "Your questions are important," the elder said softly. "But remember that the heart knows truths that the mind cannot prove. Keep your mind sharp, but do not let it harden your heart." In the corner, young Alyosha watched his brothers and his father, his gentle face reflecting both sorrow and love. He wished he could take their pain into himself, carry their burdens for them. But Father Zosima had taught him that this was not possible, nor even desirable. Each person must walk their own path, make their own choices. All Alyosha could do was love them, stand beside them, and trust that love itself had power beyond what we can measure. The gathering continued, with various people seeking the elders' counsel. Madame Koklakov confessed her doubts about her own faith, worrying that she believed only because she wanted to believe, not because she truly knew. The elder smiled gently and told her that this kind of honest doubt was itself a form of faith, better than false certainty. Little Lise, the girl in the wheelchair, asked to speak with Alyosha privately. She was lively and playful, teasing him about his monk's robes, but beneath her cheerfulness there was a genuine affection. She made Alyosha promise to visit her, and he agreed, his kind face breaking into a rare smile. As the gathering drew toward its close, Father Zosima suddenly did something unexpected. He asked about Smudyakov, the servant who had been standing silently in the corner throughout everything. The old monk looked at this strange young man with penetrating gentleness, as if he could see something in him that others missed. Smudyakov stepped forward awkwardly, unused to being noticed. The elder spoke to him about faith and doubt, about the importance of being true to oneself rather than playing roles for others. Smudyakov listened with an unreadable expression, neither accepting nor rejecting the elder's words, existing in some peculiar space of his own making. Finally, as the afternoon light began to slant through the windows, Father Zosima blessed them all. He made the sign of the cross over each person, speaking prayers in his soft, weathered voice. Even Fyodor Pavlovich fell silent during this moment, something almost like reverence flickering across his face before he caught himself and made another inappropriate joke. When it was time for them to leave, the elder once again rose and bowed deeply before Dmitri, just as he had done at their first meeting. This time he added words. "Forgive me," he said, though no one understood what the elder was asking forgiveness for. Dmitri was moved despite himself, tears springing to his eyes. For a moment, all his anger and passion gave way to something softer, a glimpse of the good man he might have been if life had been kinder to him. As the visitors departed, the monastery returned to its accustomed quietness. The bells rang for the evening prayers, their sound floating across the courtyard like a benediction. Alyosha stayed behind with Father Zosima, and the two of them sat together in the gathering dusk. "They are suffering so much," Alyosha said quietly. "Father, my brothers, all of them. Can they be saved?" The elder was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the walls of his simple cell. "We are all being saved," he finally said. "Every moment, we are being offered salvation. The question is whether we will accept it, whether we will open our hearts to the grace that is always, always present." He paused, then continued, "Your family will face great trials, Alexei. Suffering will come, as it comes to all. But remember that suffering itself is not the end. What matters is how we meet it, with bitterness or with love, with despair or with hope. You must be there for them, not to prevent their suffering, but to remind them that they are not alone in it." Alyosha bowed his head, accepting this calling even as it frightened him. That night, as the monastery settled into sleep, each member of the Karamazov family lay in their own beds, thinking about what had transpired. Fyodor lay awake in his house, the silence around him suddenly oppressive, his usual distractions failing to quiet the questions that rose in his mind. Dmitri walked the streets, his heart torn between rage and remorse, passion and despair. Ivan sat at his desk, writing furiously, trying to think his way through problems that perhaps could not be solved by thought alone. And in the monastery, Alyosha knelt in prayer, holding his broken, beautiful family in his heart, trusting that somewhere beyond all the pain and confusion, there was meaning, there was purpose, there was love. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The monastery bells had fallen silent. The world breathed in and out, like a sleeping child. Tomorrow would bring new struggles, new questions, new opportunities for grace. But tonight, in this quiet moment between moments, there was simply peace, simply the gentle darkness that cradles all things, simply the hope that love, in ways we cannot predict or control, is always working its mysterious healing in the hidden chambers of the heart. In the days following the gathering at the monastery, the town seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something inevitable to unfold. At the center of this tension was a woman whose very name carried music, Grushenka. She was beautiful in a way that defied simple description, with dark eyes that held mysteries and a smile that could mean everything or nothing at all. Grushenka lived under the protection of a wealthy merchant, occupying a comfortable house but not entirely free, existing in that peculiar space between independence and obligation. What made her story particularly poignant was her divided heart. Years ago, a Polish officer had seduced and abandoned her when she was young and innocent. That betrayal had shaped everything that followed, yet still she waited, still she hoped he might return. Both Fyodor and his son Dmitri had become captivated by her, each in his own way. For the father, she represented another conquest, another pleasure to acquire. But for Dmitri, it was something far deeper, a consuming passion that burned away everything else in his life. The problem was that Dmitri was engaged to another woman, Katerina Ivanovna, a proud and beautiful aristocrat who loved him with fierce devotion. Dmitri had once saved her father from disgrace, and in gratitude and genuine feeling, she had pledged herself to him. But now his heart had turned toward Grushenka, leaving him caught between honor and desire, duty and passion. One evening, Dmitri sent an urgent message to his brother Alyosha, asking him to meet at a tavern in town. When Alyosha arrived, he found Dmitri already drinking, his face flushed, his eyes bright with emotion and alcohol. The tavern was warm and crowded, filled with the sounds of rough laughter and clinking glasses, but in their corner there was a pocket of intimacy. "Alyosha," Dmitri said, grasping his brother's hand tightly, "I need to tell you everything. I need someone to understand what's happening to me, because I don't understand it myself." And so the words poured out of him like water from a broken dam. He spoke of Grushenka with a passion that was almost painful to witness, how she had awakened something in him he'd never felt before, how her laughter haunted his dreams, how he would wait outside her house for hours just to catch a glimpse of her. "But here's the terrible thing," Dmitri said, his voice dropping to an anguished whisper. "I'm engaged to Katya. Noble, beautiful Katya, who loves me so completely. And I'm betraying her every day with my thoughts, with my desires. What kind of man does that make me?" He took another drink, his hands shaking. "And my father, my own father, is competing with me for Grushenka. Can you imagine anything more grotesque? Father and son, both pursuing the same woman. It makes me sick with rage just to think about it." Alyosha listened without judgment, his gentle presence creating a space where Dmitri could speak his darkest thoughts without fear of condemnation. This was the gift Alyosha offered, not solutions, not advice, but simply the willingness to witness suffering without turning away. Then Dmitri began to speak about something deeper, his philosophy of life, his understanding of human nature. Despite never having studied in universities, he had developed his own wisdom through living and feeling intensely. "The thing is, Alyosha," he said, leaning forward with urgent intensity, "man is broad, too broad. I would narrow him if I could. Beauty is a terrible and awful thing. It's terrible because it cannot be fathomed, because God sets us nothing but riddles." He struggled to articulate what he meant, how the same heart that could weep over beauty could also be drawn to degradation, how nobility and baseness could exist side by side in the same soul, how a person could aspire to the highest ideals while simultaneously being pulled toward the lowest actions. "I feel it in myself," Dmitri confessed. "This awful contradiction. I'm capable of the noblest thoughts and the most shameful deeds. And Grushenka, she represents all of this for me. She's both my salvation and my destruction." As the evening wore on, Dmitri also spoke of practical desperation. He needed money, owed Katerina a significant sum that he desperately wanted to return to her, as if repaying the debt might somehow release them both from obligation. He also needed money to pursue Grushenka, to compete with his father's offers. "There's money my father owes me," he said, his eyes taking on a wild gleam. "From my mother's estate. He keeps it in an envelope, 3,000 rubles. If I could just get that money." He stopped himself, seeing the concern on Alyosha's face. "I know how it sounds. But what else can I do? I'm trapped with no way out." Meanwhile, across town in an elegant parlor, Katerina Ivanovna sat with her own troubled thoughts. She knew about Grushenka, the whole town whispered about it, yet she refused to release Dmitri from their engagement. Pride would not allow her to be defeated, to admit that she had lost him to someone she considered beneath her. That evening, she had a visitor, Ivan Karamazov, Dmitri's half-brother. Ivan had been spending increasing amounts of time at Katerina's house, ostensibly to discuss literature and philosophy, but really because something unspoken was developing between them. They sat drinking tea, speaking in careful, civilized tones about ideas and books, yet beneath the intellectual discourse ran currents of feeling neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Ivan was drawn to Katerina in ways that troubled him. She represented everything opposite to his father's crude sensuality, intelligence, refinement, nobility. Yet he felt guilty about his attraction, as if caring for his brother's fiancée was a betrayal. Katerina, for her part, found in Ivan an understanding she never felt with Dmitri. Where Dmitri was all chaos and passion, Ivan was cool and analytical. He engaged with her mind, treated her as an intellectual equal. And increasingly, she found herself looking forward to his visits more than she wanted to admit. Back at the tavern, Dmitri continued his confession to Alyosha, his words becoming more fragmented as emotion and alcohol took their toll. He spoke of childhood memories, of moments of beauty that had sustained him through dark times, a sunset, a bird's song, a stranger's unexpected kindness. "I want to be good, Alyosha," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I really do. I want to be worthy of love, worthy of respect. But something in me is broken, something that makes me destroy everything I touch." "That's not true," Alyosha said firmly. "You have a good heart, Mitya. You feel things deeply, and yes, sometimes that leads you astray. But your capacity to feel, to love, to suffer, that's what makes you human, what makes you capable of redemption." "Redemption," Dmitri repeated the word slowly. "Do you really think redemption is possible for someone like me?" "I know it is," Alyosha said with quiet conviction. "Father Zosima taught me that we're all capable of both great evil and great good. The question is which we choose. And it's never too late to choose differently." As midnight approached and the tavern began to empty, the brothers prepared to part. Dmitri embraced Alyosha tightly, grateful for his presence, for his refusal to judge or abandon. "Thank you for listening, little brother," he whispered. "Thank you for not turning away." They walked out together into the cool night air, the stars brilliant overhead. The town was mostly asleep now, only occasional lights burning in windows where others wrestled with their own struggles. Somewhere in her comfortable house, Grushenka lay awake, thinking of the men who desired her, wondering which path might lead to happiness or at least to safety. She thought of the Polish officer who had betrayed her, wondered if he ever thought of her, if he regretted leaving. In his house, Fyodor counted his money and plotted his schemes, but also felt, in moments he wouldn't acknowledge, the terrible loneliness of a life lived without love or connection. Ivan sat at his desk, writing, always writing, trying to think his way through questions that perhaps couldn't be solved by thinking alone. And Katerina paced her elegant room, her pride and her heart at war, unable to let go, unable to move forward, unable to do anything but hold tight to her determination not to be defeated. The tensions were building like storm clouds on the horizon, gathering toward some crisis that everyone could sense but no one could prevent. Each person was caught in a web of their own desires and fears, their actions affecting all the others in ways they couldn't fully see or control. But for now, in this quiet moment between midnight and dawn, even the troubled Karamazovs could rest. Alyosha walked back to the monastery, his heart full of love and concern for his brother. Dmitri stumbled home, exhausted by confession and emotion. And the town breathed softly in the darkness, holding all these passionate, complicated souls in its gentle embrace. Tomorrow would bring new struggles, new temptations, new opportunities for both grace and disaster. But tonight, there was simply the peaceful darkness, the patient stars, and the hope that somehow, despite everything, love might prove stronger than chaos, understanding deeper than judgment, and redemption possible even for the most troubled hearts. The word laceration means a wound, a tearing of flesh, something painful that breaks the surface and exposes what lies beneath. And indeed, the days that followed were full of such wounds, not physical ones, though those would come too, but wounds of the heart, of pride, of dignity. Each member of the Karamazov family, and those caught in their orbit, would experience their own particular laceration, their own tearing open of carefully maintained surfaces. Alyosha moved through these days like a gentle presence in a storm. After his long conversation with Dmitri, he found himself called to navigate between all these suffering souls, trying to bring comfort where he could, trying to understand what he couldn't fix. Father Zosima had told him that this was his calling, to be present to suffering, to witness it without turning away, but that didn't make it any easier. One morning, as Alyosha walked through the town on an errand for the monastery, he encountered a group of schoolboys. They were clustered together in an empty lot near the bridge, and as he drew closer, he saw that they were tormenting another boy, a smaller child who stood apart from them, his clothes shabby, his face defiant even as tears streaked his cheeks. The boys were throwing stones at him, not large ones that might seriously injure, but small ones meant to humiliate, to sting, to remind him of his lower status. The boy being tormented had shaggy hair and fierce eyes, and even as the stones struck him, he didn't run. Instead, he picked up stones of his own and threw them back, fighting alone against the group. "Stop!" Alyosha called out, hurrying toward them. His monk's robes and gentle manner usually commanded respect, but these boys were caught up in the cruel excitement of their game. The boy being tormented turned and, seeing Alyosha approaching, did something unexpected. He picked up a stone and threw it directly at Alyosha, striking him on the shoulder. Then, before anyone could react, the boy turned and ran, disappearing into the narrow streets with surprising speed. Alyosha stood there, rubbing his shoulder where the stone had hit, more puzzled than hurt. The other boys began to explain, talking over each other in their eagerness to justify their behavior. The boy was named Ilyusha, they said. His father was a retired military captain who had fallen on hard times, and the family lived in terrible poverty. Just recently, something shameful had happened. Ilyusha's father had been involved in some public humiliation, and now the boy was an outcast, mocked by his former friends. As the boys talked, Alyosha began to understand. The father, Captain Snegiryov, had been the man Dmitri had dragged by his beard through the tavern, the man he had publicly humiliated in a fit of rage over some perceived slight or debt. And now the son was paying the price for his father's shame, bearing the burden of adult conflicts he didn't understand and couldn't control. Alyosha's heart ached for this boy who had thrown the stone, not from cruelty, but from a wounded pride that wouldn't allow him to accept kindness from anyone, even someone trying to help. He resolved to find the boy's family, to see if there was any way he could offer assistance or comfort. But first, there was another visit he needed to make. Katerina Ivanovna had sent word that she urgently needed to speak with him. When Alyosha arrived at her elegant house, he found her in a state of agitation, pacing the room with barely contained energy. "Alyosha," she said, grasping his hands, "I need your help. I need you to understand what I'm trying to do, because I'm not sure I understand it myself." She led him to sit, then began to explain in rapid, passionate words. She had decided, she said, to save Dmitri despite himself. She would not abandon him, would not release him from their engagement, even though she knew about Grushenka, even though the whole town whispered about his infidelity. "Don't you see?" she said, her eyes blazing. "This is exactly when he needs me most. When he's fallen, when he's lost, when everyone else would turn away, that's when I must stay. That's what love means." But as she spoke, Alyosha heard something else beneath her words. Not just love, but pride. The pride of a woman who refused to be defeated, who would prove her nobility through sacrifice, who would demonstrate her superiority through suffering. It was love, yes, but love mixed with something harder, something that might ultimately destroy both her and Dmitri. "Katerina Ivanovna," Alyosha said gently, "are you doing this for Dmitri, or for yourself?" She stopped pacing and stared at him, shocked by the question. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, and he saw confusion and pain beneath. But then she lifted her chin proudly. "What difference does it make?" she said. "I will save him. That's all that matters." Before Alyosha could respond, there was a commotion at the door, and suddenly Grushenka herself swept into the room. She had come uninvited, unannounced, drawn perhaps by some instinct that her rival was speaking of her, or perhaps simply by the recklessness that characterized so much of what happened in this story. The two women faced each other. Katerina tall and aristocratic in her expensive dress, Grushenka smaller but vibrant, dressed more simply but with an undeniable presence. The air between them crackled with tension. What followed was a strange and terrible scene. Grushenka, with a kind of wild honesty, confessed that she had been playing with Dmitri's affections, amusing herself with the devotion of both father and son. But then something shifted in her manner, and she fell to her knees before Katerina, kissing the hem of her dress. "Forgive me," Grushenka said, and for a moment it seemed genuine, a real reaching out from one suffering woman to another. Katerina's face softened. She reached down to help Grushenka up, and for a brief moment, they stood together, two women caught in the same painful web, perhaps recognizing their shared humanity. But then Grushenka's mood changed again, as mercurial as summer weather. She laughed, stood up, and spoke with sudden cruelty. "You thought I was serious? You thought I would really humble myself before you?" And with that, she swept out of the room, leaving devastation behind. Katerina stood frozen, her face white, trembling with humiliation and rage. She had been made to look foolish, had been tricked into showing kindness only to have it thrown back in her face. Alyosha watched helplessly as she struggled to regain her composure. "You see," she finally said, her voice shaking. "You see what she is? And yet Dmitri prefers her to me. He chooses that over this." She gestured at herself, at her nobility and pride, and in that gesture Alyosha saw the depth of her wound. He left Katerina's house with a heavy heart, feeling the weight of all these tangled relationships, all these wounded people wounding each other in turn. Everyone was suffering, and everyone was causing suffering, and it seemed impossible to break the cycle. His next task was to find the Snegiryov family, to see if he could somehow help them. He asked for directions and was led to a poor part of town, to a ramshackle house that leaned slightly to one side, as if it were tired of standing. When he knocked, the door was opened by a woman with a worn face, Ilyusha's mother. Inside, the house was sparsely furnished but clean, kept with the kind of desperate dignity that poverty allows. There was a girl in a corner, clearly ill, and another daughter who seemed mentally disabled, sitting and making strange sounds to herself. And there was Captain Snegiryov himself, a small, nervous man with a scraggly beard and eyes that darted about constantly, as if expecting another blow from the world. When he saw Alyosha, he started talking rapidly, making jokes, playing the fool just as Fyodor Pavlovitch did, but with even more desperation. This was a man who had been broken by life and was trying to hold himself together with humor and chatter. Alyosha explained why he had come. He had been sent by Katerina Ivanovna, he said, who wanted to help the family. She was offering money, 200 rubles, as a kind of compensation for the wrong that had been done to them. At the mention of money, the captain's whole manner changed. His eyes lit up, and he began to talk about all the things he could do with such a sum. He could move his family to another town, start fresh where no one knew of their shame. He could get proper medicine for his sick daughter. He could buy his wife a new dress, his son new shoes. He spoke faster and faster, painting pictures of the life they could have, the dignity they could regain. He reached out his hand to take the money that Alyosha offered, his fingers trembling with eagerness and need. But then, just as his hand was about to close around the bills, something shifted in his face. His expression changed from hope to anguish, and suddenly he threw the money on the ground and trampled it beneath his feet. "I can't take it," he cried out. "Don't you see? If I take this money, I'm accepting the humiliation, I'm admitting that we can be bought off, that my dignity has a price. What will I tell my boy? How can I look Ilyusha in the eye if I sell our honor for 200 rubles? He was weeping now, his whole body shaking with sobs. "My boy saw it happen," he said. "He saw your brother drag me by my beard, saw me humiliated in front of the whole tavern, and has suffered for it every day since. How can I explain to him that we're taking money from the people who destroyed us?" Alyosha stood there helplessly, the money scattered on the floor, understanding that he was witnessing another laceration, the wound of a proud man forced to choose between his dignity and his family's survival. Whatever choice the captain made would cost him something irreplaceable. Finally, still sobbing, the captain asked Alyosha to leave. He couldn't take the money, but he also couldn't bear to have it in his sight any longer. Alyosha picked up the bills and left, his heart aching for this family trapped in poverty and shame, unable to accept help because help itself felt like another form of humiliation. As he walked back through the town in the fading afternoon light, Alyosha thought about all the wounds he had witnessed that day. The wounded pride of young Ilyusha, throwing stones at everyone including those trying to help. The wounded vanity of Katerina, choosing sacrifice as a form of superiority. The wounded dignity of Captain Snegiryov, preferring poverty to shame. And beneath it all, the original wound, Dmitri's violent action, born from his own wounded pride and rage. Each wound created new wounds. Each act of violence rippled outward, touching innocent lives, creating suffering that spread like circles in water. And yet Alyosha also saw something else, the possibility of healing, of connection, of grace. Katerina, for one moment, had reached out to Grushenka with genuine kindness. The captain, even in his desperation, had chosen honor over expedience. These moments mattered, even if they led to more pain. That evening, back at the monastery, Alyosha knelt in the chapel and prayed for everyone he had encountered that day. He prayed for the schoolboys learning cruelty from the cruelty they witnessed. He prayed for Ilyusha and his family, trapped in poverty and shame. He prayed for Katerina and Grushenka, both suffering in their different ways. He prayed for his brother Dmitri, whose violent temper had set so much of this in motion. And as he prayed, he felt Father Zosima's teaching settling deeper into his heart. We are all responsible for one another. Every action has consequences that spread beyond what we can see. The only way to break the cycle of wounding is through love, through forgiveness, through the willingness to absorb pain rather than pass it on. The chapel was quiet except for his whispered prayers and the soft sound of candles flickering. Outside, the sun had set, and stars were beginning to appear. The town settled into evening, each person carrying their own wounds, their own burdens, their own private struggles. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to wound or to heal, to turn away or to stay present. But for now, in this moment of quietness and prayer, there was simply the breath of hope, hope that love might prove stronger than pride, that healing might be possible even for the deepest wounds, that grace might break through even the hardest hearts. The title of this chapter in the Karamazov family story means for and against, arguments on both sides of a great question. And the question that Ivan Karamazov wrestled with was perhaps the greatest question of all. Can we accept the world as it is? Can we say yes to existence, with all its suffering and injustice? Or must we, in honesty and conscience, rebel? It was evening when Ivan and Alyosha met at a restaurant in town. They had not spent much time alone together. These two brothers were so different in temperament and belief that conversation between them had always been cautious, circling around deeper topics without quite landing on them. But tonight, something had shifted. Ivan wanted to talk, really talk, and Alyosha was willing to listen. The restaurant was modest but comfortable, with simple wooden tables and the warm smell of food. They ordered dinner and sat across from each other, the golden light of oil lamps casting soft shadows on their faces. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the intellectual and the monk, the skeptic and the believer, yet undeniably brothers, sharing the same blood and the same complicated family. "Alyosha," Ivan began, his voice thoughtful and measured, "I want to tell you something about how I see the world. Not to convince you, not to argue, but because you're my brother and I want you to understand me." Alyosha nodded, his gentle face open and attentive. "I want to understand you, Ivan. I want to know what you think about." Ivan leaned back in his chair, considering where to begin. "Let me start with this. I accept God. Does that surprise you? People think I'm an atheist, but I'm not. I accept that God exists. What I cannot accept, what I will not accept, is His world." He paused, letting this sink in. "You see, the question isn't whether God exists. The question is whether we can justify the world He has created, whether we can say that it's good, whether we can accept the price that has been paid for whatever harmony might exist." Alyosha listened quietly, sensing that his brother was building toward something important, something that had been weighing on him for a long time. Ivan continued, his voice growing more intense. "Let me give you examples. I've been collecting stories, Alyosha, stories about children who suffer. Not adults, mind you. Adults have eaten the apple, they know good and evil, they've made their choices. But children are innocent. They haven't done anything to deserve suffering." He began to describe the stories he had collected, speaking with a kind of controlled passion. He told of a 5-year-old girl beaten by her parents, locked in a freezing outhouse overnight for some minor transgression. He told of a serf boy torn apart by dogs because he accidentally injured one of the general's hunting hounds, torn apart while his mother was forced to watch. He told of children starving, children abused, children dying in ways that no imagination should have to contemplate. As Ivan spoke, Alyosha's eyes filled with tears. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to argue or defend. He simply bore witness to his brother's pain, to the anguish of someone who felt too much and thought too deeply about suffering. "Now tell me," Ivan said, leaning forward, his eyes burning with intensity, "what possible harmony, what ultimate meaning, what future paradise could justify even one child's tears? They tell us that in the end, everything will be explained, everything will be reconciled, the lion will lie down with the lamb, and all will sing Hosanna to God. But at what cost?" He paused, his voice dropping to something almost like a whisper. "If the price of admission to that harmony is the suffering of even one innocent child, then I respectfully return my ticket. I don't want to participate in such a harmony. It's not that I don't accept God, Alyosha. It's that I most respectfully return him the entrance ticket." The words hung in the air between them, and Alyosha felt the full weight of his brother's rebellion. This wasn't casual atheism or flippant skepticism. This was a profound moral protest, a refusal to accept a world where innocence suffers and calls it good. "But Ivan," Alyosha said softly, "there is one being who can forgive everything, who suffered innocently himself. Ah, Ivan interrupted, you mean Christ. Yes, I knew you would come to that. And that brings me to something I've written, a kind of poem or fantasy. Let me tell it to you. And so Ivan began to tell the story of the Grand Inquisitor, one of the strangest and most profound tales ever conceived. Alyosha listened, transfixed, as his brother wove a story within their story. The setting, Ivan said, was Seville during the Spanish Inquisition, during the worst days of the Auto da Fe, when heretics were burned daily for the glory of God. And into this scene, Christ returns, not in glory at the end of time, but quietly, walking the streets of Seville. The people recognize him immediately. How could they not? His eyes hold infinite compassion, his presence radiates love. He performs quiet miracles, healing a blind man, raising a dead child. The crowd begins to gather, weeping with joy, reaching out to touch his garments. But the Grand Inquisitor, the cardinal who oversees the burning of heretics, sees what is happening and orders Christ arrested. That night, in the darkness of a prison cell, the old Inquisitor comes to visit his prisoner. Is it you? The Inquisitor asks. Is it really you? He doesn't wait for an answer. Instead, he begins to speak, a long, passionate monologue that is part accusation, part confession, part explanation of everything the Church has done in Christ's name. Why have you come to interfere with us? The Inquisitor demands. We have spent 1500 years correcting your work. You wanted to give humanity freedom, but we have taken that burden from them. You rejected the three temptations in the desert, miracle, mystery, and authority, but we have embraced them, because that is what people really need. The Inquisitor explains his philosophy with terrible logic. People cannot bear freedom, he argues. They cannot bear the responsibility of choosing between good and evil. They don't want the bread of heaven, they want earthly bread and security. They don't want to love freely, they want to be told what to believe and how to live. We have corrected your work, the Inquisitor says with grim satisfaction. We have given them miracle, mystery, and authority. We have taken away their freedom and given them happiness. Tomorrow I will burn you at the stake, and the people will help gather the wood, because we have taught them to obey. Throughout this entire speech, Christ says nothing. He simply listens, looking at the old man with infinite compassion. And at the end, when the Inquisitor is finished, when he has poured out all his bitterness and justification, Christ does only one thing. He approaches the old man and kisses him gently on his aged lips. The Inquisitor trembles. He opens the door. Go, he says. Go and never come back. Never. And Christ walks out into the dark streets of Seville, silent as he came. When Ivan finished his story, there was a long silence in the restaurant. The other diners talked and laughed around them, but at their table, the brothers sat in stillness, each absorbed in the weight of what had been said. Finally, Alyosha spoke. Your poem is a praise of Jesus, not a rejection of him. Ivan smiled slightly, surprised. Perhaps. I'm not sure myself what it means. But do you see what I'm trying to say? Alyosha? The Grand Inquisitor believes his being kind, believes his protecting humanity from the terrible burden of freedom. And maybe he's right. Maybe people can't bear to be free. Maybe the world cannot be run on Christ's principles. But Christ's kiss, Alyosha said. He forgave the Inquisitor. He loved him even in his error. Yes, Ivan said quietly. The kiss burns in the old man's heart. But he still sends Christ away. He still chooses his own way over Christ's. They sat together as the evening deepened, talking of other things now, of their family, of Dmitri's troubles, of practical matters. But the weight of their earlier conversation remained, settling between them like something they would both carry away from this meeting. As they prepared to leave, Alyosha reached out and touched his brother's arm. Ivan, he said, I understand your rebellion. I understand why you returned the ticket. But I also believe that in the end, love is stronger than logic, that mercy is deeper than justice, that somehow, in ways we can't understand, even the suffering of innocence is not the final word. Ivan looked at his younger brother with something like affection, mixed with sadness. Your monk's faith is beautiful, Alyosha. I hope you never lose it. But I cannot share it. I will live my life with my rebellion, my refusal, my return ticket. And we will see, in the end, which of us was right. They embraced outside the restaurant, there in the dark street with stars overhead and the town settling into sleep around them. Two brothers, two different answers to the same great questions, but bound together by blood and by a strange kind of love that transcended their differences. Alyosha walked back toward the monastery, his mind full of his brother's words. He thought about the suffering children, about the Grand Inquisitor's terrible logic, about Christ's silent kiss. He thought about how easy it would be to lose faith in the face of so much pain, how Ivan's arguments had a kind of terrible clarity to them. But he also thought about Father Zosima's teachings, about how love transforms suffering, how presence matters even when we cannot fix things, how the mystery of faith is not about having answers but about trusting in something beyond our understanding. The monastery bells rang for Compline, the final prayers of the day. Their sound floated across the town, a reminder of something eternal, something that persisted regardless of arguments for or against. Alyosha joined the other monks in the chapel, their voices rising together in the ancient prayers, creating a web of sound that seemed to hold and comfort all the suffering world. Ivan, meanwhile, walked alone through the dark streets, his brilliant mind still wrestling with the questions that gave him no rest. He had spoken his truth to his brother, had shared his deepest thoughts, but the sharing had not lightened his burden. If anything, it had made it heavier, more real. He thought about the Grand Inquisitor, about whether he had written that story to condemn the Church or to express his own deepest fears, that perhaps freedom was too much for humanity, that perhaps his own intellect was a kind of prison, that perhaps the questions he asked so brilliantly had no answers that reason could reach. Somewhere in the town, Dmitri was drinking in a tavern, acting out his own rebellion through passion and excess. Somewhere, their father was counting his money and planning his schemes. Somewhere, all the people Ivan had described in his stories, the suffering children, the cruel adults, the innocent and the guilty, were living their lives, bearing their burdens, seeking meaning or escape or simply survival. And above them all, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent or compassionate depending on how you chose to see them, holding either the evidence of God's presence or the proof of His absence, depending on which ticket you held, which arguments you accepted, which faith or rebellion you embraced. In the quiet of the monastery, as evening light slanted through the simple windows of his cell, Father Zosima knew that his time was drawing near. His body, which had carried him faithfully through so many years, was growing weaker with each passing day. But his spirit remained bright, and he felt called to share his story, the journey that had brought him from worldly pride to spiritual peace. Alyosha sat at his elder's bedside, along with several other monks and visitors who had gathered to hear the old man speak. The room was hushed, filled with a quality of attention that comes when people sense they are witnessing something sacred, something that should be remembered and treasured. "Let me tell you," Father Zosima began in his soft, weathered voice, "about the life I lived before I came to understand what truly matters. For I was not always as you see me now. I was once a young man full of pride and ambition, concerned only with honor and reputation." He paused, gathering his strength, and then began to tell the story of his youth. He had been born into a good family, he explained, and had followed the path expected of young men of his class. He became an officer in the military. He wore his uniform with pride, enjoyed the admiration of society, and lived for pleasure and distinction. "I thought I knew what life was about," the elder said with a gentle smile. "I thought it was about being respected, being feared, being superior to others. And then something happened that changed everything." He told them about a woman he had loved, or thought he loved, a beautiful young lady who had rejected him in favor of another man. His pride had been wounded so deeply that he challenged his rival to a duel. This was the way of things in those days. Honor demanded satisfaction, and satisfaction meant violence. The night before the duel, unable to sleep, the young officer, the man who would become Zosima, returned home in a foul mood. His servant, a quiet man who had served him faithfully, did something that displeased him. In his rage and frustration, the young officer struck his servant across the face, knocked him down, and beat him. The servant said nothing, simply got up and continued his duties. But that silent acceptance, that refusal to respond with anger or complaint, planted something in the young officer's heart, a seed that would grow into understanding. The next morning, as he prepared for the duel, the young officer looked out his window at the beauty of the dawn. Birds were singing, flowers were blooming, the world was radiant with life. And suddenly he was struck by a terrible realization. What right did he have to take another man's life over wounded pride? What right did he have to destroy this beauty, this sacred gift of existence, because his vanity had been hurt? More than that, he remembered his servant's face as he had beaten him, remembered the injustice of his action, the cruelty of it. He saw clearly for the first time that he had been living entirely for himself, treating others as objects to serve his needs or obstacles to his desires. At the dueling ground, as his opponent prepared to fire, the young officer did something extraordinary. He threw down his pistol and begged for forgiveness, not just from his opponent, but from the world, from God, from all of existence. "Forgive me," he said, and the words came from the deepest part of his soul. "I have been blind. I have been cruel. I have lived as if I were the only person who mattered. Forgive me." The crowd that had gathered to watch the duel was shocked. Some thought he had gone mad. His opponent, confused and uncertain, lowered his weapon. The duel ended without bloodshed, but the young officer's old life ended as well. He could not return to his former ways, could not pretend that nothing had changed. From that moment, Father Zosima told his listeners, "I began to see the world differently. I began to understand that we are all connected, that every action ripples outward, that we are all responsible for one another." He resigned his commission, gave away most of his possessions, and eventually found his way to the monastery. But he did not come as someone fleeing the world in disgust. Rather, he came as someone who had discovered a great truth and wanted to dedicate his life to understanding it more deeply and sharing it with others. The elder then spoke of another man who had influenced him profoundly, his older brother Michael, who had died young but whose wisdom had shaped everything that followed. Michael had been an angry young man, a skeptic who mocked religion and faith. But when he fell ill with consumption and knew he was dying, something transformed within him. In his final weeks, Michael became radiant with joy and love. He asked forgiveness from everyone, the servants, his family, even the birds outside his window. He spoke of how beautiful the world was, how every moment was precious, how everyone was responsible for everyone else. "We are all guilty for everyone and everything," Michael had said. "If only people knew this, the whole world would become a paradise at once." These words, spoken by a dying teenager, had lodged in the heart of the younger brother and had shaped his entire spiritual path. Father Zosima had spent his life trying to understand and embody what Michael had grasped in those final illuminated weeks. Now, as he lay in his cell surrounded by those who loved him, Father Zosima wanted to pass on these teachings. He spoke of how we must love all of God's creation, not just people, but animals, plants, even stones and dust. Everything is connected in a great web of being, and when we learn to love truly, we see that web and become part of it consciously. "Love all God's creation," he said, his voice growing softer, "the whole of it and every grain of sand. Love every leaf, every ray of God's light. Love the animals, love the plants, love everything. If you love everything, you will perceive the divine mystery in things." He spoke of how love in dreams is easy. We imagine ourselves performing great acts of charity and feel noble. But love in practice is harsh and dreadful in comparison. It requires patience, persistence, the willingness to keep loving even when we receive nothing in return, even when we are misunderstood or rejected. Active love is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams, he said. But it is the only real love, the only love that transforms us and the world. The elder taught that we should not judge others, for we cannot know the full story of any soul, cannot see all the circumstances that shape them, cannot understand all the battles they fight within themselves. Instead of judging, we should take responsibility, recognizing that perhaps if we had loved more, been more present, been more understanding, the person we want to judge might have turned out differently. Everyone is responsible for everyone else in every way, he repeated, echoing his brother's words. And I most of all. As the evening deepened and candles were lit in the cell, Father Zosima's voice grew quieter, but his words seemed to carry even more weight. He spoke of how life is paradise, but we fail to see it because we are caught up in our own concerns, our own desires, our own suffering. The paradise is already here, already present, waiting only for us to open our eyes and hearts to it. Life is paradise, he whispered, and we are all in paradise, but we don't want to know it. If we did want to know it, tomorrow the whole world would become paradise. Alyosha, listening to his beloved teacher, felt tears streaming down his face. He understood that he was receiving not just teachings but a kind of spiritual inheritance, a way of seeing and being in the world that he would carry forward after the elder was gone. Father Zosima smiled at his young disciple with infinite tenderness. "Do not be troubled, Alexei," he said. "I am leaving you, but I am also entrusting you with something precious, the knowledge that love is possible, that transformation is possible, that despite all the suffering and confusion in the world, goodness is real and stronger than evil." The old monk closed his eyes, exhausted from speaking but peaceful. Those gathered in the cell sat in silence, each person holding the elder's words in their hearts, knowing they had been given a great gift. Outside, the monastery bells rang for evening prayers, their sound floating across the courtyard and into the town beyond. The world continued its turning. People struggled and loved, hurt and healed, sought meaning or fled from it. But in this quiet cell, in the presence of this dying monk, there was a pocket of peace, a reminder that wisdom exists, that love is real, that the divine mystery touches everything if we learn to see it. Alyosha would carry these teachings forward into the complicated world of his family, into the struggles that awaited him. But for now, he simply sat beside his teacher, grateful for every moment, knowing that this gift of wisdom would guide him through whatever darkness lay ahead. Father Zosima died as gently as he had lived, slipping away from this world with a peaceful smile on his aged face. Those who had been with him in his final moments spoke of how serene he looked, as if he was simply falling asleep after a long and meaningful day. But what happened next shook Alyosha to his very core. The monks prepared the elder's body according to custom, laying him out in his simple cell, expecting that miracles might attend the passing of such a holy man. The faithful gathered, waiting for signs of grace, perhaps a sweet fragrance, perhaps visions, perhaps the body remaining uncorrupted as sometimes happened with saints. Instead, the opposite occurred. By the next day, the elder's body began to show signs of decomposition, and quickly, unmistakably. A terrible odor began to emanate from the cell, growing stronger as the hours passed. It was, in the eyes of many, a scandal, a disgrace, a sign that perhaps Father Zosima had not been as holy as everyone believed. For Alyosha, this was devastating. His faith, which had seemed so solid, suddenly felt fragile. If God could allow this to happen to Father Zosima, the kindest and wisest man he had ever known, what did that say about divine justice? Where was the miracle that should have attended such a holy death? He wandered away from the monastery in a daze, his heart heavy with confusion and doubt. Other monks whispered and speculated. Father Therapon, who had always disapproved of Zosima's gentle approach, proclaimed loudly that this was God's judgment on false teaching. Even some who had loved the elder began to question, to wonder if they had been deceived. In this state of spiritual crisis, Alyosha received a message that Grushenka wanted to see him. Rakitin, a cynical seminary student who had never liked Alyosha's purity, offered to take him to her, secretly delighted at the prospect of the innocent monk being corrupted. Alyosha went, not caring much where he went or what happened. His whole world had been shaken, and he felt lost in a way he had never experienced before. Grushenka received him in her comfortable rooms, initially planning to amuse herself by tempting this innocent young monk. But when she saw his face, the genuine suffering there, the loss and confusion, something shifted within her. Instead of the seductress she had intended to be, she became almost maternal, concerned, tender. "What's wrong?" she asked, and the genuine compassion in her voice broke something open in Alyosha. He told her about Father Zosima, about his faith being shaken, about feeling abandoned by God. And Grushenka, this woman whom society judged harshly, this woman caught in her own web of desire and survival, responded with unexpected grace. She comforted him simply, without pretense, offering the kindness of one human being to another. In her presence, Alyosha realized something profound. Goodness exists everywhere, not just in monasteries and holy men. This woman, whom others called a sinner, was capable of pure compassion. The divine mystery that Father Zosima had spoken of was present here too, in this unlikely place, in this unexpected moment. Alyosha left Grushenka's house changed. His crisis of faith had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something deeper, a more mature understanding that faith is not about miracles and signs, but about love and presence and the mysterious ways that grace appears in the world. He returned to the monastery as evening fell. In the cell where Father Zosima's body lay, Father Pacey was reading from the Gospel of John, the story of the wedding at Cana, where Christ turned water into wine, performing his first miracle not in a temple but at a celebration, not to prove his power but to save a wedding feast from embarrassment. As Alyosha listened to the familiar words, something opened within him. He knelt by his elder's coffin and began to pray, but not the prayer of desperate petition he had prayed before. This was a prayer of gratitude, of acceptance, of understanding. And then something extraordinary happened, not a miracle in the conventional sense, but a spiritual experience that would shape the rest of Alyosha's life. As he prayed, he felt as though Father Zosima was present, not as a corpse but as a living presence, smiling at him, calling to him. In his vision or dream or mystical experience, he could never quite name what it was, Alyosha saw the wedding at Cana, and Father Zosima was there, welcoming him, telling him that it was good to be joyful, that life was meant to be celebrated, that God's love was vaster and more generous than anyone could imagine. "Do not be afraid of life," the elder seemed to say. "Go forth into it with joy and love. Fall down and kiss the earth. Water it with your tears of joy. Love all of creation, and you will find God everywhere." When Alyosha rose from his prayer, he walked out into the monastery garden. The night was clear, the stars brilliant overhead, countless and beautiful. And in that moment, something broke open in his heart. All the doubt, all the confusion gave way to an overwhelming sense of joy and connection. He fell to his knees and then prostrated himself on the earth, embracing it, kissing it, watering it with his tears just as the elder had instructed. He felt connected to everything, to the earth beneath him, to the stars above, to every person who had ever lived or would ever live, to all of creation in its vast mystery and beauty. When he stood up, he was changed. The boyish novice who had entered this crisis was gone, replaced by someone deeper, stronger, more fully himself. He had passed through doubt and emerged not with simple faith restored, but with something more mature and resilient, a faith that could hold complexity, that could embrace mystery, that could find God not just in miracles but in ordinary kindness, not just in holy men but in flawed human beings reaching out to one another with unexpected grace. The night air was cool and sweet. The monastery bells would ring soon for morning prayers. Life would continue with all its complications and sorrows. But Alyosha carried within him now a joy that could not be shaken, a connection that could not be severed, a love that would guide him through whatever lay ahead. He walked slowly back toward the monastery, his steps steady, his heart full. Father Zosima's body would decay as all bodies must, but his teachings had taken root in Alyosha's soul, transformed from abstract wisdom into lived experience, from words into a way of being. The night was gathering like a dark cloak around the town, and Dmitri Karamazov moved through it with the energy of a man possessed. His heart was racing, his mind churning with desperate plans, his whole being focused on a single burning need. He had to find money, and he had to find Grushenka. Earlier that day, Dmitri had learned that Grushenka might be leaving, going to her former lover, that Polish officer who had abandoned her years ago and now, mysteriously, wanted her back. The thought of losing her drove Dmitri to the edge of madness. He had to see her, had to know if she truly meant to go, had to try one more time to win her heart. But first, he needed money. Without it, he could offer her nothing, could not compete with what others might give her. He owed Katerina 3,000 rubles, a debt that weighed on his conscience like a stone. If he could just repay that debt, he thought, perhaps he could be free to pursue Grushenka without the burden of obligation to another woman. Dmitri's first stop was to a woman named Madame Koklakov, the wealthy widow who had visited Father Zosima. He arrived at her house in a state of wild agitation, bursting into her parlor with barely controlled energy. "I need 3,000 rubles, he announced without preamble. "Lend it to me, and I'll repay you with interest. I have prospects, expectations." But Madame Koklakov, though she received him kindly, had no intention of lending him money. Instead, she launched into an enthusiastic speech about gold mines. She had been reading about them, she said, and Dmitri should invest in gold mines. That was the way to make a fortune, not borrowing money for immediate needs. Gold mines, she repeated, her eyes shining with the fervor of someone who has discovered a new enthusiasm. You could make millions. Forget about borrowing, think about the future. Dmitri listened with increasing desperation and frustration. He didn't want advice about gold mines or future fortunes. He needed money now, tonight, this very moment. But Madame Koklakov continued talking, oblivious to his distress, until finally he could bear it no longer and left abruptly, leaving her startled by his sudden departure. Outside in the cold night air, Dmitri's thoughts turned darker. He remembered the envelope his father kept in his desk. 3,000 rubles set aside for Grushenka, meant to lure her to spend a night with him. The thought of it made Dmitri's blood boil with rage and jealousy. That money should have been his by right, from his mother's estate. His father had cheated him, kept what was rightfully his. He found himself walking toward his father's house, his heart pounding, his hands trembling. What was he planning to do? He didn't know exactly. Perhaps just to confront his father, to demand what was owed. Perhaps something more. The boundaries between intention and action felt blurred, dangerous. The house was dark except for a single light in his father's window. Dmitri crept into the garden, moving through the shadows like a thief. He could see into his father's room, could see Fyodor moving about, waiting for Grushenka, hoping she would come to him. A terrible rage filled Dmitri's heart. The sight of his father, this man who had neglected him as a child, cheated him as an adult, and now competed with him for the woman he loved, it was unbearable. His hand found the brass pestle he had taken from the mortar in the garden, a heavy weight that felt dangerous in his grip. For a moment, everything hung in balance. Dmitri stood there in the darkness, wrestling with himself, with the violence that rose in him like a tide. But then he saw that Grushenka was not there, was not coming. His father was waiting in vain. And somehow this realization broke the spell. Dmitri turned and fled from the garden, the pestle still clutched in his hand. But his night of desperate wandering was not over. He learned that Grushenka had indeed gone to meet her Polish officer, but not at his father's house. She had gone to Mokroy, a village some distance away, to the inn where she had apparently arranged to meet her former lover. The news struck Dmitri like a physical blow. She had gone to him, to that man who had seduced and abandoned her. After everything, after all of Dmitri's passion and devotion, she had chosen the past over the present, the memory over the reality. Something broke inside Dmitri then. If he had lost her, if she was truly gone, then what did anything matter? He would go to Mokroy too. He would see her one last time. And then, he didn't know what would happen then. Perhaps he would end his own life. Perhaps something else. The future seemed dark and final. But first, he needed money for the journey, money for wine and food, money to make a grand gesture. In his desperation, he remembered that a merchant named Samsonov's son owed him a small debt. He went to collect it, and through a combination of persuasion and the young man's sympathy, managed to gather enough for his purposes. Then Dmitri did something extraordinary in his desperation. He gathered up bottles of wine, champagne, food, delicacies, everything needed for a feast. He hired a cart and set off through the night toward Mokroy, determined to create one final celebration, one last moment of joy before whatever darkness awaited him. The journey through the night had a dreamlike quality. The road stretched ahead in the moonlight, the horses' hoofs beating a steady rhythm, and Dmitri sat in the cart surrounded by bottles and food, like a man preparing for either a wedding or a funeral, he couldn't have said which. When he finally arrived at the inn at Mokroy, it was late into the night. The building glowed with light and echoed with music and laughter. Dmitri burst in like a force of nature, immediately commanding attention with his wild appearance and his lavish provisions. And there she was, Grushenka, sitting with her Polish officer and his companion. Dmitri's heart clenched at the sight of her, beautiful and alive, laughing at something the Pole had said. But when she saw Dmitri, something flickered in her eyes, surprise, confusion, something that might have been relief. Dmitri commanded the best room in the inn, ordered the wine to be opened, invited everyone to join his celebration. He was like a man possessed, throwing money around, laughing too loudly, trying to create through sheer force of will an atmosphere of joy that might mask his desperation. The Polish officer and his companion were more than happy to drink Dmitri's wine and eat his food. They played cards, they told stories, they drank toast after toast. But gradually, as the night wore on, something began to shift. The Polish officers, who had initially seemed so dignified and romantic, began to reveal their true natures. They were gamblers and schemers, interested primarily in Grushenka's money, or what they thought she might have. They cheated at cards, they made crude jokes, they showed themselves to be far less noble than they had appeared. And Grushenka, watching them, began to see clearly what Dmitri had seen from the beginning, that her romantic memory of the past had obscured the shabby reality. This man who had seduced her when she was young was not the hero she had imagined waiting for all these years. He was simply a man, and not even a particularly good one. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside, as the celebration grew more chaotic and surreal, Grushenka moved closer to Dmitri. She looked at him with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time the depth of his devotion, the genuineness of his love beneath all his wild passion. "Mitya," she said softly, using his familiar name. "It's you. It's always been you. I just couldn't see it." Those simple words transformed everything. Dmitri, who had come expecting to lose everything, who had prepared himself for death or disaster, suddenly found himself on the verge of having his deepest wish fulfilled. Grushenka loved him. She chose him. Not his father, not the Polish officer, but him. They sat together as the celebration continued around them, talking quietly, making plans, dreaming of a future together. Dmitri spoke of how they would leave, start fresh somewhere new, live simply and honestly. Grushenka agreed, her eyes shining with the possibility of happiness. "We'll work," Dmitri said earnestly. I'll work in the mines if I have to. We'll earn our bread honestly. And we'll be happy, Grusha. We'll finally be happy. It was the sweetest moment of Dmitri's life, this dawn hour when everything seemed possible, when love had finally triumphed over all obstacles. He held Grushenka's hand, looked into her eyes, and felt that despite all his mistakes and violence and chaos, he had finally found his way home. But even as they sat together making their plans, even as happiness seemed finally within reach, there were sounds outside, the sounds of horses arriving, of official voices, of authority approaching. The door burst open, and police officials entered, their faces grave and formal. They had come, they announced, to arrest Dmitri Karamazov. His father, Fyodor Pavlovich, had been found murdered in his house, his head bashed in with a heavy object. And Dmitri, who had been seen in the garden that very night, who had threatened his father publicly many times, who had the motive and the opportunity and the violent temperament, Dmitri was the obvious suspect. The joy drained from Dmitri's face as he realized what was happening. Just as he had found love, just as happiness had finally come within reach, it was all being torn away. He was innocent of this crime. He had fled the garden without harming his father, had left him alive though waiting. But who would believe him? He looked at Grushenka, saw the horror and confusion in her eyes. "I didn't kill him," he said, his voice breaking. "I swear to you, I didn't do it. I wanted to, God knows I wanted to, but I didn't." And even as the officials began to bind his hands, even as his night of desperate seeking ended in this terrible dawn, Dmitri clung to one truth: Grushenka loved him. Whatever happened now, whatever punishment awaited him, he had known in those brief hours before arrest what it meant to be truly loved, and that knowledge would have to sustain him through whatever darkness lay ahead. The morning sun rose over the village of Mokroy, but for Dmitri Karamazov, the light brought no comfort. He sat in a room at the inn, now transformed from a place of celebration into a place of interrogation, surrounded by officials who looked at him with suspicion and certainty. They believed they had caught their murderer, and everything Dmitri said or did seemed only to confirm their conviction. The investigating magistrate was a young man named Nikolai Neludov, who took his duties very seriously. He was meticulous, formal, following every procedure with careful attention. Beside him sat the prosecutor, Ippolit Kirillovich, an older man with a sharp mind and a tendency to construct elaborate theories about criminal psychology. Together, they began the long process of questioning Dmitri about the events of the previous night. Dmitri's situation appeared damning from every angle. He had publicly threatened his father many times, declaring his hatred in front of witnesses. He had been seen in his father's garden on the very night of the murder. He had arrived at Mokroy with a large sum of money, about 3,000 rubles, at the very moment his father was found dead with 3,000 rubles missing from his desk. And he carried with him the brass pestle that could have been the murder weapon, now mysteriously absent. "Where did you get the money?" they asked him again and again. This was Dmitri's greatest difficulty. The truth was complicated and humiliating. He had not stolen it from his father, had not committed murder for it. But the real source was something he felt deeply ashamed to reveal. The truth was this. Weeks earlier, Katerina Ivanovna had entrusted Dmitri with 3,000 rubles to send to her sister in another city. But Dmitri, desperate and irresponsible, had spent half of it, 1,500 rubles, on a wild celebration with Grushenka. The remaining 1,500 he had sewn into a cloth pouch and worn around his neck like a shameful secret, a constant reminder of his dishonor. He had told himself he would repay it, would make it right somehow. But he had kept the money, unable to let go of it entirely, unable to fully commit his theft but unable to return it either. It hung around his neck for weeks, this evidence of his dishonesty, burning against his chest like a brand. The night before, when he learned Grushenka had gone to meet her Polish officer, Dmitri had torn open that pouch and spent the money on his last desperate celebration. That was where his 3,000 rubles had come from, not from murder, but from a different kind of crime, one that shamed him perhaps even more deeply. But how could he explain this to the investigators without destroying Katerina's reputation? If he revealed that she had trusted him with money and he had betrayed that trust, it would humiliate her publicly. She who was so proud, so concerned with honor, he couldn't do that to her, even now, even to save himself. "I can't tell you," Dmitri said stubbornly, miserably. "I won't reveal where the money came from. But I swear to you, I didn't kill my father. I didn't take his money. I left him alive." The investigators exchanged knowing glances. This refusal to explain the money seemed like clear evidence of guilt. What innocent man would withhold information that could prove his innocence? They questioned him about every detail of that night. When had he arrived at his father's house? What had he been doing in the garden? Why had he taken the pestle? Where was it now? Dmitri answered as truthfully as he could, though the truth sounded damning even to his own ears. Yes, he had gone to his father's garden. Yes, he had wanted the money his father kept there. Yes, he had been filled with rage and jealousy. Yes, he had climbed the fence, had crept through the shadows, had looked through the window. "I had the pestle in my hand," he admitted. "And I wanted to kill him. God forgive me, I wanted it with all my soul. But I didn't do it. Something stopped me, I don't know what. Disgust, maybe. Or maybe some last shred of conscience. I saw he was alone, that Grushenka hadn't come to him, and somehow that broke the spell. I ran away. I left him alive, I swear it." But who could believe such a story? A man admits to wanting to kill, to having the means and opportunity, to being in the very place at the very time, and yet claims he somehow refrained? It seemed like the desperate lie of a guilty man. The investigation continued for hours. They examined Dmitri's clothes and found them stained with blood. Dmitri explained that he had struck his father's servant, Grigory, who had chased him in the garden. That was where the blood came from. But this only made things worse. Another act of violence, another victim. They asked him to undress so they could examine his clothing more carefully. This humiliation, standing nearly naked before strangers who looked at him with suspicion and judgment, was almost more than Dmitri could bear. He who was so passionate, so proud, so full of fierce dignity, to be reduced to this, to be treated like a common criminal, to have every aspect of his life and body examined and found wanting. Throughout it all, Dmitri maintained his innocence, but his very manner worked against him. He was too emotional, too volatile, laughing at inappropriate moments, weeping at others, declaring his love for Grushenka when he should have been focused on his defense. To the rational minds of the investigators, his behavior seemed like that of a guilty man unraveling under pressure. There were moments of kindness even in this terrible process. The young magistrate, though convinced of Dmitri's guilt, was not cruel. He offered him tea, spoke to him with a certain courtesy, tried to make the proceedings as bearable as possible within the constraints of his duty. And outside the room where the interrogation took place, Grushenka waited, weeping and distraught. She who had finally found love, who had finally chosen happiness, now faced losing it all. She tried to see Dmitri, tried to speak on his behalf, her voice breaking as she declared his innocence to anyone who would listen. The most painful moment came when they brought in witnesses, people who had heard Dmitri's threats, who had seen his violence, who could testify to his hatred of his father. One by one, they told their stories, and each story added another weight to the scales of evidence against him. Even Grushenka was questioned, though gently. She told them of Dmitri's love, of his wild generosity, of the celebration at the inn. But she could not account for where he had been earlier that evening, could not provide the alibi that might have saved him. As the day wore on, as the questions continued endlessly, Dmitri began to feel a strange kind of resignation settling over him. Perhaps this was his fate, he thought. Perhaps he deserved punishment, if not for this crime then for all the others, for his violence, his irresponsibility, his sins against Katerina, against his father, against everyone he had ever hurt. There was something almost biblical about it, he reflected in his more philosophical moments. He had wanted to kill his father, had desired it with murderous intensity. Was there really such a difference between the desire and the deed? In his heart, he had committed the crime even if his hands had not. Perhaps God was punishing him not just for what he did but for what he wanted to do. I accept it, he said at one point, startling the investigators. If this is my punishment, I accept it. I'm guilty of wanting to kill him. I'm guilty in my heart. Maybe that's enough. But then he would remember Grushenka, would remember their brief hours of happiness, their plans for a simple life together. He would remember that life might still be possible, that love might still be waiting if only he could prove his innocence. And he would rally, would insist again that he hadn't done it, that someone else must have killed his father, that there must be another explanation. The investigators, meanwhile, were constructing their theory of the crime. They believed Dmitri had climbed into his father's house through the window, had struck him down with the pestle, had taken the 3,000 rubles, and had then fled to Mokroe to celebrate his crime with Grushenka. Every detail seemed to fit their theory perfectly. Only a few things troubled them. Where was the pestle? Dmitri claimed to have dropped it in the garden when he fled, but searchers had not found it. And one of the servants, a man named Smudyakov, had suffered an epileptic fit that very night and was found unconscious near the scene. Could he have witnessed something? But these small mysteries were not enough to shake their certainty. They had their murderer, they believed, and the case was essentially solved. All that remained was the formal trial. As evening approached and the long day of interrogation finally drew to a close, Dmitri was officially charged with the murder of his father. He would be taken to the town jail to await trial. The weight of this reality settled on him like chains. They allowed him a brief moment with Grushenka before they took him away. She ran to him, threw her arms around him, sobbing against his chest. "I love you," she said fiercely. "Whatever happens, I love you. I'll wait for you. I'll fight for you. I know you didn't do this." Dmitri held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, memorizing the feel of her in his arms. "Even if they convict me," he whispered, "even if I spend the rest of my life in prison, these hours with you will have been worth it. You loved me. You chose me. That's more than I ever dared hope for." They pulled him away gently but firmly. As he was led out to the cart that would take him back to town, Dmitri looked up at the sky. It was evening now, and stars were beginning to appear, just as they had the night before when everything had seemed possible, when happiness had been within reach. He thought of Father Zosima's teaching that Alyosha had shared with him, that we are all responsible for everyone and everything, that suffering has meaning even when we cannot understand it, that redemption is always possible even in the darkest circumstances. "I didn't kill him," Dmitri said quietly to himself as the cart began to move. "But perhaps I deserve this anyway. Perhaps this is my path to becoming someone better. If I must suffer, then let me suffer well. Let me learn something from it. Let me become worthy of the love I've been given." The cart rolled through the darkening countryside, carrying Dmitri away from his brief moment of happiness toward an uncertain future. Behind him, Grushenka stood watching until he disappeared from view, her hand pressed to her heart. And somewhere in the town, Alyosha was praying for his brother, holding him in his thoughts with steady, unwavering love. While the adult world of the Karamazov swirled with passion and tragedy, another story was unfolding quietly among the children of the town, a story of friendship, loyalty, and the slow healing of wounds that seemed impossible to mend. Alyosha had not forgotten the boy who had thrown a stone at him weeks before, young Ilyusha Snegiryov, son of the retired captain whom Dmitri had humiliated so publicly. The memory of that angry, wounded child haunted Alyosha, calling him back again and again to try to help. Through patient inquiry, Alyosha had learned more about the situation. Ilyusha had once been popular among the schoolboys, a lively and friendly child. But after his father's humiliation, everything had changed. The other boys, sensing weakness, had turned on him with the casual cruelty that children can inflict without fully understanding the pain they cause. There was one boy in particular who had tried to defend Ilyusha, a serious, intelligent child named Kolya Krasotkin. Kolya was something of a leader among the boys, admired for his cleverness and his fearless nature. He had a sharp mind and an independent spirit, reading books beyond his years and thinking thoughts that made adults uncomfortable. But Kolya had been away for several weeks, and in his absence, the persecution of Ilyusha had intensified. The boy had become isolated, fighting alone against groups of his former friends, his pride refusing to let him accept kindness from anyone. Now Alyosha learned something that broke his heart. Ilyusha had fallen ill. The combination of stress, malnutrition, and the constant emotional strain had weakened his body, and he had taken to his bed with what the doctor gravely said might be consumption. The boy was dying, slowly and painfully, in that poor little house that leaned to one side as if too weary to stand straight. When Alyosha heard this news, he immediately went to visit. He found Ilyusha in bed, his small face pale and thin, his eyes too large in his wasted face. But when the boy saw Alyosha, something lit up within him, not anger this time, but a desperate kind of hope. "I'm sorry I threw the stone at you," Ilyusha whispered. "I'm sorry for everything." Alyosha sat beside the bed and took the boy's small hand in his. "There's nothing to forgive," he said gently. "You were hurting, and hurt people sometimes lash out. I understand that now." Around the bed gathered Ilyusha's family, his father, the captain, who hovered anxiously, trying to be cheerful but unable to hide his grief, his mother, confused and ill herself, his sisters, one disabled and one trying desperately to hold the household together. They were all suffering, all caught in a web of poverty and sorrow that seemed to have no exit. But then something wonderful began to happen. Word spread among the schoolboys that Ilyusha was seriously ill, and one by one, they began to come to visit. Some came out of genuine remorse for how they had treated him. Others came because Alyosha encouraged them, speaking to them about forgiveness and friendship. And they came because children, beneath their cruelty, often have hearts that can still be reached. The boys would gather outside Ilyusha's window, calling up to him, bringing small gifts, a toy, a sweet, a drawing. They told him they were sorry, that they missed him, that they wanted to be friends again. And Ilyusha, from his bed, would smile weakly and wave to them, forgiving them with the generosity that children can sometimes show more easily than adults. Then Kolya Krasotkin returned to town. When he heard about Ilyusha's illness and about how the other boys had treated him in his absence, he was furious with them and furious with himself for not being there to prevent it. He decided he must visit Ilyusha immediately, must try to make amends. Kolya was a complicated boy, proud, intelligent, sometimes arrogant in the way clever children can be. He had read socialist literature and declared himself a progressive thinker. He questioned authority and tradition. He was, in many ways, a younger version of Ivan Karamazov, full of ideas and questions and a certain contempt for conventional wisdom. But beneath his intellectual posturing was a good heart, and when he arrived at Ilyusha's bedside, bringing with him his beloved dog Perezvon, all his cleverness fell away, leaving only genuine emotion. "Ilyusha," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I'm sorry I wasn't here. I should have protected you." Ilyusha's face transformed with joy at seeing his friend. "Kolya, you came. And you brought a dog." For a moment, the dying child was just a child again, delighted by the presence of a friendly animal. There was another dog in Ilyusha's story, a tragic one. Weeks before, when the bullying had been at its worst, an older boy had cruelly suggested that Ilyusha feed a dog a piece of bread with a pin hidden inside it. Ilyusha, desperate to prove himself, to show he wasn't weak, had done this terrible thing. The dog, a stray he had befriended, had run off yelping in pain, and Ilyusha had never seen it again. The guilt of this action had haunted Ilyusha ever since. He had hurt an innocent creature, had betrayed a friend, and the memory tormented him more than any of the other children's cruelty. In his fever, he would call out for the dog, apologizing, begging forgiveness. Now Kolya revealed something wonderful: the dog hadn't died. Kolya had found it, had nursed it back to health, and had trained it. And though this wasn't exactly the same dog Ilyusha had hurt, Kolya gently suggested it might be, giving the dying boy the gift of believing he might be forgiven for his worst action. Alyosha watched all of this with quiet joy. He saw how the boys were learning lessons about compassion and loyalty, about how suffering could bring people together rather than drive them apart. He saw how even in this tragedy, perhaps especially in this tragedy, something beautiful was growing. The schoolboys began to visit regularly, not out of duty but out of genuine affection. They would gather around Ilyusha's bed, telling him stories from school, bringing him news of the outside world, making him laugh when they could. They became a kind of brotherhood, united by their love for their dying friend. Kolya and Alyosha formed a special friendship during these visits. Kolya would challenge Alyosha with his progressive ideas, his skeptical questions, his youthful certainty about how the world should be changed. And Alyosha would listen patiently, never dismissing Kolya's thoughts but gently offering different perspectives, showing through his presence that faith and intelligence were not opposites. "You're not like other religious people," Kolya admitted one day. "You don't try to force your beliefs on others. You just are who you are. That's all any of us can do," Alyosha replied. "Be who we are, as honestly and lovingly as we can." As the days passed, Ilyusha grew weaker, but the room around him grew brighter with friendship. Captain Snegiryov, watching the boys gather around his son, felt his heart breaking and healing simultaneously. His boy, who had been so alone, was surrounded by love in his final days. One afternoon, when the low sun filled the room with golden light, Ilyusha called all the boys close to his bed. "Promise me something," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Promise that after I'm gone, you'll remember me. And promise that you'll be kind to each other, that you won't let anyone be alone the way I was alone." The boys, tears streaming down their faces, promised. They held each other's hands around Ilyusha's bed, creating a circle of friendship that would outlast his brief life. Alyosha stood nearby, watching this scene with profound emotion. This was what Father Zosima had taught, that love creates connections that transcend death, that kindness ripples outward in ways we cannot measure, that even tragedy can become a teacher if we let it open our hearts rather than close them. Outside the window, evening was falling gently over the town. Somewhere, Dmitri sat in his cell awaiting trial. Somewhere, Ivan wrestled with his dark thoughts. Somewhere, all the complicated adult dramas continued their turbulent course. But here, in this small room with these children, something pure and simple was happening. Love was being learned. Forgiveness was being practiced. And a group of boys was discovering that the bonds of true friendship could transform suffering into something that, while still painful, was also somehow beautiful. While Dmitri sat in his prison cell awaiting trial, while Alyosha moved through the town bringing comfort where he could, Ivan Karamazov was descending into his own private hell, a hell not of punishment, but of conscience, not of external judgment, but of internal torment. The days following their father's murder were strange and difficult for Ivan. He had left town just before the killing, almost as if he had known something terrible was about to happen and wanted to be far away when it did. But distance provided no escape from the thoughts that pursued him, the questions that gave him no rest. Ivan had never loved his father. How could anyone love such a man? He had often thought that the world would be better without Fyodor Pavlovich in it. He had even said as much, though carefully, obliquely, in conversations that seemed theoretical but carried dangerous undertones. And there was Smerdyakov, the servant, possibly his father's illegitimate son. Ivan had engaged in many philosophical discussions with this strange, pale young man, talking about morality and God and what might be permitted if there were no divine authority. If there is no God, Ivan had said, more than once, then everything is permitted. Smerdyakov had listened to these discussions with his peculiar intensity, his hooded eyes revealing nothing, his careful voice asking questions that seemed innocent but weren't. And now, after the murder, Ivan couldn't stop thinking about those conversations, couldn't stop wondering what seeds he might have planted in that dark and twisted mind. After the murder, Smerdyakov had been found unconscious from an epileptic fit. He had been ill ever since, confined to bed, unable to be questioned by the authorities. This illness seemed convenient, too convenient, and Ivan found himself obsessed with the need to speak to Smerdyakov, to understand what had really happened that night. The first time Ivan visited Smerdyakov in his sickbed, the servant seemed weak and pathetic, speaking in a whining voice about his illness, about how terrible his condition was. But there was something underneath his complaints, something that made Ivan uneasy, a kind of knowing look, a hint of mockery in his tone. "It's terrible about your brother," Smerdyakov said. "Such a passionate man, so prone to violence. No one is surprised that he would do such a thing." Ivan tried to draw him out, to get him to say directly what he seemed to be implying. But Smerdyakov remained evasive, speaking in circles, suggesting much but stating nothing clearly. As Ivan left that first visit, he felt disturbed in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Something was wrong, something beyond the obvious tragedy of his father's death and his brother's arrest. But his rational mind couldn't grasp what it was. Meanwhile, Ivan found himself drawn repeatedly to Katerina Ivanovna. She was in a state of intense agitation, torn between her pride and her love for Dmitri, between her desire to save him and her hurt at his betrayal. Ivan came to her house ostensibly to discuss Dmitri's defense, to plan how they might help him at trial. But really, they were drawn together by something else, something neither was willing to name. Their conversations were charged with unspoken feeling. They sat close together, their hands sometimes touching, their eyes meeting with a kind of desperate intensity. Ivan felt himself falling deeper into love with her, even as he knew it was wrong, knew that his brother's fiancée was forbidden territory, knew that his feelings were a betrayal. "We must save him," Katerina would say, her eyes shining with determination and tears. "We must prove his innocence." But Ivan could hear in her voice a question, "And if we save him, what then? What becomes of us?" Ivan visited Smerdyakov a second time, and this visit was different. The servant seemed stronger now, more confident. He sat up in bed and looked at Ivan with eyes that held no servility, only a strange kind of equality, as if they were co-conspirators rather than master and servant. "You know, don't you?" Smerdyakov said quietly. "Deep down, you know what happened." "Tell me plainly," Ivan demanded, his heart beginning to race. But Smerdyakov only smiled his peculiar smile and spoke in riddles, suggesting that perhaps someone had wanted Fyodor Pavlovich dead, had even encouraged it, had created the conditions that made it possible. Someone whose philosophical ideas had provided justification for an act that might otherwise seem unconscionable. Ivan left that second visit feeling sick, his brilliant mind beginning to construct terrible possibilities that he didn't want to face. But still, the full truth eluded him, or rather, he kept it at bay through a kind of willful blindness. It was after the third visit that everything finally became clear. This time, Smerdyakov abandoned all pretense. He spoke plainly, coldly, laying out the truth with cruel precision. He had killed Fyodor Pavlovich. He had done it while Dmitri was in the garden, while everyone would naturally suspect the passionate, violent son. And he had done it believing he was carrying out what Ivan truly wanted, what Ivan's philosophy had sanctioned. "You said everything is permitted if there is no God," Smerdyakov said, his voice flat and accusatory. "You said it again and again. What did you think I would do with such knowledge? You are the real murderer. I was only your instrument." He told Ivan about the 3,000 rubles, how he had taken them, how he had them still. He offered to share them, as if they were partners in crime. And he insisted, with a terrible logic, that Ivan was more guilty than he was, because Ivan had planted the idea, had created the intellectual justification, had even left town at the crucial moment, as if giving permission for what was to happen. Ivan listened to all this with growing horror. His hands shook, his face went pale, and something inside him began to crack. He had always believed in the power of ideas, in the supremacy of reason, in the importance of intellectual freedom. But now he saw the terrible consequence of his abstractions made concrete, his theories turned into action, his words transformed into murder. "You're lying," Ivan said, but his voice was weak, unconvincing even to himself. Smerdyakov only laughed, a bitter, mocking sound. "Am I? Or am I simply the logical conclusion of your philosophy?" If there is no God, if everything is permitted, then why shouldn't I kill a worthless old man and take his money? You taught me that, Ivan Fyodorovich. You and your brilliant ideas. Ivan fled from that final meeting in a state of complete disorder. His mind, which had always been his pride and his refuge, now turned against him. Thoughts spun in circles, questions multiplied endlessly, and guilt he had never felt before, never believed in, began to consume him from within. He wandered the streets of the town in the dark evening, not knowing where he was going, barely seeing what was around him. His rational worldview, so carefully constructed, was collapsing. If he was responsible for his father's death, if his ideas had caused this murder, then what did that say about the value of ideas, about the meaning of responsibility, about the nature of guilt? He had always prided himself on his honesty, on facing difficult truths without flinching. But now he understood that there were truths too terrible to bear, realities that could destroy the mind that perceived them too clearly. That night, as Ivan returned to his room, something extraordinary and terrible happened. He was alone, exhausted, feverish with the beginning of an illness brought on by stress and guilt. He sat at his desk, trying to think, trying to make sense of everything. And then he looked up and saw a figure sitting across from him, a gentleman in somewhat shabby but respectable clothes, with a knowing smile and a familiar face. It was the devil. Or rather, it was Ivan's devil, a projection, a hallucination, an externalization of his own doubts and self-accusations. But to Ivan, feverish and broken, the devil seemed entirely real. The devil spoke to Ivan in a familiar, almost friendly tone, as if they were old acquaintances. He made jokes, told stories, offered observations about humanity and morality. He was not the terrifying demon of religious tradition but rather a shabby, somewhat pathetic figure who claimed to suffer from rheumatism and complained about the inconveniences of existence. But beneath his casual manner, the devil spoke truths that cut Ivan to the heart. He mocked Ivan's intellectual pretensions, pointed out the contradictions in his thinking, and forced him to confront the consequences of his philosophy. He was, in essence, Ivan's own self-judgment made visible, his conscience given voice and form. You wanted to be free of moral constraints, the devil said with a smile. You wanted to believe that everything was permitted. Well, congratulations, you've achieved your goal. And look where it's brought you. Ivan argued with the devil, shouted at him, tried to reason with him. But the devil only laughed, turned Ivan's arguments back on him, revealed the weaknesses in every position he took. It was like arguing with himself, which of course was exactly what Ivan was doing, arguing with the part of himself that knew the truth, that felt the guilt, that couldn't escape the reality of what he had helped to cause. You don't exist. Ivan cried out. You're just a fever dream, a hallucination. Of course I don't exist, the devil agreed amiably. But that doesn't make me any less real to you, does it? I am your thoughts, Ivan Fyodorovich. I am your doubts and your fears and your guilt. You can't banish me by denying my existence, because I am part of you. This nightmarish dialogue continued for hours, or what seemed like hours. Time had lost its normal quality. Ivan felt as if he were going mad, as if his brilliant mind was fragmenting into pieces, as if the careful structure of reason he had built his life upon was collapsing into chaos. Then suddenly there was a knock at the door. Alyosha had come, worried about his brother, sensing that something was wrong. When Ivan opened the door, wild-eyed and disheveled, Alyosha immediately saw that he was in crisis. "Ivan, what's happened? You look terrible." Ivan grabbed his brother's arm with desperate strength. "I've been talking to the devil," he said, his voice breaking. "And Alyosha, I'm guilty. I killed father. Not with my own hands, but I wanted it, I encouraged it, I made it possible. Smutyakov was right, I'm the real murderer." Alyosha listened with deep compassion as Ivan poured out his confession, speaking rapidly, feverishly, barely coherent. He told Alyosha about Smutyakov's confession, about his own guilt, about the devil who had visited him. And as he spoke, tears ran down his face, the first tears he had shed since childhood, tears for his father, for Dmitri, for Smutyakov, for himself, for the terrible consequences of living as if ideas had no real-world cost. "Tomorrow," Ivan said, his voice shaking, "tomorrow I must testify at Dmitri's trial. I must tell them the truth, that Smutyakov killed father, that Dmitri is innocent. Even if it destroys me, even if they don't believe me, even if I sound like a madman, I must tell the truth." Alyosha held his brother, this brilliant, tortured man who had always seemed so strong and self-sufficient. "Yes," he said gently. "You must tell the truth. That's the only way forward now. The truth, whatever it costs." But even as they spoke, even as Ivan resolved to do the right thing, his mind was fragmenting further. The fever that had been building now consumed him fully. His thoughts became more disordered, his perception more unstable. The clear, rational intellect that had been his defining characteristic was giving way to something more chaotic, more human, more broken. Alyosha stayed with his brother through that long night, holding his hand, praying silently, offering the comfort of presence when words were inadequate. He understood that Ivan was undergoing a transformation, not a comfortable one, not a gentle one, but perhaps a necessary one. The proud intellectual was being broken open, forced to confront realities that his philosophy had tried to deny. The reality of guilt, of responsibility, of the weight of our actions on others, of the impossibility of living purely in the realm of ideas. As dawn approached, Ivan's fever reached its height. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking coherently about the trial, sometimes muttering about the devil, sometimes crying out for forgiveness from someone. Father, Dmitri, God, himself, no one could say. And in those hours before morning, something shifted in Ivan. The man who had prided himself on his reason, who had returned his ticket to God's harmony, who had believed that everything was permitted, that man was dying. What would be born from this death of the old self, no one yet knew. But something was changing, some transformation was occurring in the crucible of his suffering. Outside the window, the stars faded as the sky began to lighten. The town was waking to the day of Dmitri's trial, the day when all these tangled stories would come together in the courtroom, when truth and lies would battle for dominance, when the fate of one brother would be decided while another lay in the grip of fever and guilt and transformation. Alyosha looked at his suffering brother with infinite compassion, then looked out at the awakening town, and prayed, for Ivan, for Dmitri, for all of them, that somehow, through all this darkness, light might find a way to break through. The day of the trial dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself were indifferent to the human drama about to unfold. The courthouse in the small provincial town was packed with spectators, not just townspeople, but visitors from surrounding areas who had heard about this sensational case. A patricide, they whispered to each other. A son who murdered his father over money and a woman. It was the kind of story that fascinated people, that made them feel both horrified and somehow superior. The courtroom itself was arranged with careful formality. The judges sat at their elevated bench, presiding over the proceedings with practiced solemnity. The jury, 12 ordinary men from the town and nearby areas, sat in their box, trying to look serious and thoughtful, aware that a man's life rested in their hands. And everywhere, packed into every available space, sat the spectators, come to witness justice or spectacle or both. Dmitri was brought in, looking pale but somehow dignified. Prison had changed him. The wild energy that had always characterized him seemed quieter now, turned inward. He wore simple clothes, his beard had grown longer, and his eyes held a kind of steady sadness. When he saw Grushenka in the crowd, his face softened, and she gazed back at him with unwavering devotion. The prosecutor, Ippolit Kirillovich, had prepared his case meticulously. He was a man who loved the drama of the courtroom, who saw each trial as a kind of performance where logic and rhetoric could reveal truth. He had constructed a narrative about Dmitri that was compelling in its clarity, a passionate, violent man, driven by jealousy and greed, who murdered his father in a moment of rage. The defense attorney was Fetyukovich, a famous lawyer from Moscow whom Katerina had hired at great expense. He was known for his cleverness, his ability to create reasonable doubt, his skill at turning a case around through unexpected arguments. But even he faced a difficult task. The evidence against Dmitri seemed overwhelming. The trial proceeded through its formal stages. Witnesses were called, each adding their piece to the mosaic of that fateful night. The servants testified about the conflicts between father and son, about Dmitri's threats, about finding the body. Medical experts described the wounds. The evidence was laid out piece by piece, the blood on Dmitri's clothing, the money he had spent at Mokroy, his presence in the garden at the crucial time. Throughout all this testimony, Dmitri maintained his innocence with a kind of quiet insistence. "I did not kill my father," he repeated when asked. "I wanted to, God help me, I wanted to, but I did not do it." Then came the testimony of the women in Dmitri's life, and the atmosphere in the courtroom became even more charged. Grushenka testified first, and she was magnificent in her loyalty. She spoke of Dmitri's love, of his generosity, of his passionate but fundamentally good nature. She insisted that he was incapable of such a calculated crime, that whatever violence he might commit would be in the heat of passion, never this cold-blooded murder for money. "He loved me," she said simply, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "And I love him. I know his soul. He is not a murderer." Some in the audience were moved by her devotion. Others dismissed her as a woman blinded by love, unable to see the truth about the man she had chosen. Then came Katerina Ivanovna, and everyone leaned forward in anticipation. Her testimony would be crucial, for she had been Dmitri's fiancée, had known him intimately, had every reason to want revenge for his betrayal. What would she say? Katerina appeared composed, almost regal in her bearing. She wore simple but elegant clothing, and she held herself with the pride that was so characteristic of her. She began her testimony by speaking of Dmitri's noble qualities, of how he had saved her father from disgrace, of his capacity for generosity and honor. The prosecutor was puzzled. This was not what he had expected. Was she going to defend the man who had humiliated her by choosing another woman? But then something shifted. Katerina's composure began to crack. Her voice grew more agitated, her words more rapid. And suddenly, dramatically, she produced a letter Dmitri had written to her in a drunken state weeks before the murder. "Here is proof," she cried out, her voice breaking with emotion. "Here, in his own hand, he writes that he will kill his father if necessary to get the money he needs. Read it. Read what he wrote." The letter was passed to the judges, and a clerk read it aloud. In crude, desperate language, Dmitri had indeed written that he would do anything to get money, even kill his father. The words, written in passion and probably not meant literally, now sounded like a confession of premeditated intent. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Dmitri sat stunned, staring at Katerina with a look of betrayal and anguish. Grushenka cried out from the audience, calling Katerina terrible names. And Katerina herself seemed almost in a trance, as if she couldn't believe what she had just done, as if some force beyond her control had driven her to this ultimate betrayal. She had destroyed the man she claimed to love, had provided the prosecution with the most damning evidence possible. But why? Was it revenge for his choosing Grushenka? Was it wounded pride demanding satisfaction? Or was it some more complex mixture of love and hate, the desire to save him warring with the desire to punish him, until punishment won out in a moment of emotional collapse? After this dramatic moment, there was a recess, and the courtroom buzzed with conversation. Everyone agreed that Katerina's testimony had sealed Dmitri's fate. No jury could ignore such evidence. But then came an unexpected witness, Ivan Karamazov. Ivan appeared in the courtroom looking terrible. He was feverish, pale, his eyes wild, his movements unsteady. Alyosha, watching from the audience, felt his heart clench with worry. Ivan should not be here, should be in bed recovering. But he had insisted on coming, had dragged himself from his sickbed to testify. When Ivan took the stand, a strange silence fell over the courtroom. Everyone could see that he was ill, that something was very wrong with him. But what did he have to say? Ivan began to speak, and his words came out in a rush, disordered and intense. He told them about Smerdyakov, about the philosophical conversations they had had, about how he had essentially given Smerdyakov permission to kill through his ideas about morality without God. "I am the murderer," Ivan declared, his voice shaking. "Not Dmitri. Smerdyakov killed our father, but I am responsible. I taught him that everything was permitted. I created the conditions. I am guilty." He reached into his pocket and pulled out money, 3,000 rubles, the money Smerdyakov had taken from their father and given to Ivan as proof of his confession. "Here is the evidence," Ivan cried. "Here is the money from father's envelope. Smerdyakov gave it to me before he stopped, swaying slightly. The courtroom was in confusion. What was this testimony? Was Ivan confessing to the murder? Was he covering for his brother? Or was he simply mad, raving in the grip of fever and guilt? The judges conferred quietly. The prosecutor objected that this testimony was unreliable, coming from a man who was clearly ill, possibly delirious. How could they verify any of what he said? Smerdyakov himself had died, had hanged himself just the night before, leaving no possibility of confirmation. Ivan grew more agitated, insisting they must believe him, that Dmitri was innocent, that the real murderer was dead but he himself bore the moral guilt. But his manner worked against him. He seemed unstable, unreliable, perhaps even mad. And as his testimony continued, he began to speak of the devil, of conversations he had had with a supernatural visitor, and the courtroom's skepticism grew. Finally, Ivan collapsed, crying out about the devil, about guilt, about the impossibility of living with what he knew. He was carried from the courtroom, still protesting, still insisting on Dmitri's innocence. And the trial continued without him, his testimony dismissed as the ravings of a sick mind. Alyosha rushed after his brother, his heart breaking for Ivan's suffering and for the terrible irony of the truth being spoken but not believed. The trial moved toward its conclusion. The prosecutor gave his closing speech, a masterful piece of rhetoric that painted Dmitri as a symbol of a generation that had lost its moral bearings, that lived for passion and pleasure without restraint, that inevitably ended in violence and patricide. He spoke eloquently about the sanctity of fatherhood, about the breakdown of family bonds, about the need for justice to assert moral order. Then Fechukovich, the defense attorney, gave his response. And it was brilliant. He argued that the evidence was entirely circumstantial, that no one had actually seen Dmitri commit the murder, that the missing pestle had never been found, that Smerdyakov had had equal opportunity and perhaps greater motive. He spoke about reasonable doubt, about the danger of convicting a man based on assumptions and prejudices rather than proof. Most controversially, he questioned whether patricide was really such a heinous crime when the father in question had been as worthless as Fyodor Pavlovich. Was a cruel, neglectful, selfish father truly owed the same respect as a good father? This argument shocked many in the courtroom, seemed to attack the very foundation of family and society. Finally, Dmitri himself was allowed to speak. He stood and addressed the court with surprising eloquence, born from weeks of suffering and reflection. "I am guilty of many things," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I am guilty of being a dissolute man, of wasting my life in pleasure and passion. I am guilty of threatening my father, of hating him, of wanting him dead. But I am not guilty of killing him. That crime I did not commit." He spoke of his transformation in prison, of how suffering had changed him, of how he had come to understand that he needed to accept his fate, whatever it might be, as a kind of redemption for all his other sins. "If you convict me," he said, "I will accept it. Perhaps I deserve punishment, if not for this crime then for my life itself. But I tell you before God, I did not kill my father." Then the jury retired to deliberate, and everyone waited with held breath. The spectators debated among themselves, some convinced of Dmitri's guilt, others moved by doubt. The two camps seemed almost equal, and no one could predict which way the verdict would fall. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, and still the jury deliberated. Dmitri sat quietly, his head bowed, seemingly at peace with whatever judgment would come. Grushenka wept silently. Alyosha prayed. Finally, as evening approached, the jury returned. The foreman stood, and in the hushed courtroom, he read the verdict: guilty. Guilty of patricide. Guilty of murder with intent to rob. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Grushenka screamed and fainted. Katerina sat frozen, her face white as snow, staring at what she had helped to cause. And Dmitri stood and accepted the verdict with a strange calmness. "I forgive you all," he said quietly. "But I am innocent of this crime." He was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in Siberia. 20 years in the mines, in chains, far from everything and everyone he loved. It was essentially a life sentence for a man of his age and temperament. But in the chaos after the verdict, something unexpected was being planned. Katerina, overcome with remorse for her testimony, was arranging with others for Dmitri's escape. Money could buy the cooperation of guards. He could flee to America, could start a new life with Grushenka far from Russia. It would mean permanent exile, but it would mean freedom. That evening, as Dmitri sat in his cell, Alyosha came to visit him. The two brothers sat together in the dim light, and despite everything, there was a kind of peace between them. "I've learned something in here," Dmitri said quietly. "I've learned that suffering can be a kind of teacher. Father Zosima was right. We are all responsible for everyone, and perhaps I am responsible for this crime even if I didn't physically commit it. Perhaps we all create the conditions for each other's sins." He spoke of his plans to escape, of starting over in America, of living a simple life of honest work with Grushenka. "I'll work with my hands," he said. "I'll earn my bread. And maybe, through work and love, I can become someone better than I was." Alyosha embraced his brother, tears streaming down his face. "You are already better than you were," he said. "You've transformed your suffering into understanding. That's what Father Zosima taught, that we can choose how we meet what life brings us. Outside, the stars were emerging in the darkening sky. The trial was over, but the story was not finished. There would be escape and exile, new beginnings and continued struggles. Ivan would recover slowly from his breakdown, forever changed by his confrontation with guilt and conscience. Katerina would live with her divided heart, her pride and her remorse. And Alyosha would continue his quiet work of love and presence, carrying Father Zosima's teachings into a world that desperately needed them. But for tonight, in this moment, there was simply the peace of two brothers together, holding on to love in the face of injustice, finding meaning in the midst of suffering, trusting that somehow, in ways beyond their understanding, grace was still at work in the world. The story of the Karamazov family was drawing toward its close, but not with despair, rather, with a strange mixture of sorrow and hope, of endings and beginnings intertwined. Just days after the trial, young Ilyusha Snegiryov finally succumbed to his illness. The boy who had thrown stones out of wounded pride, who had been surrounded by loving friends in his final days, slipped away peacefully, his father holding his hand. The schoolboys gathered around his bed keeping their vigil of love. The funeral was held on a bright, cold day. Captain Snegiryov walked behind the small coffin, his face frozen in a grief too deep for tears. And following him came the boys, Kolya and all the others, walking together in solemn procession, honoring their friend, keeping their promise to remember him. At the grave, as the prayers were said and the small coffin was lowered into the earth, the boys stood in a circle, their young faces serious, understanding perhaps for the first time that death was real, that people they loved could be taken away, that life was precious and brief. After the ceremony, Alyosha gathered the boys around him at a large stone near the grave, the very stone where Ilyusha used to sit during happier days. He looked at their faces, these children who had learned so much through their friendship with the dying boy, and he felt moved to speak to them about what they had experienced together. "My dear children," Alyosha said gently, "you have done something beautiful here. You have learned what it means to be true friends, to be loyal, to love someone even in their suffering. Ilyusha's last days were surrounded by your affection, and that was a great gift you gave him." The boys listened intently, some with tears still fresh on their cheeks. "I want you to remember this moment," Alyosha continued. "Remember your friend, remember what you learned from knowing him. People say that memories from childhood, especially good memories, can save us later in life. When you are older, when life becomes difficult, and it will become difficult, remember this day. Remember how you loved your friend. Remember how you stood together." Kolya, the proud, intelligent boy who had befriended Ilyusha, spoke up. "We will remember Karamazov. We'll remember forever. And we'll remember you too, and what you taught us." Alyosha smiled at them with infinite tenderness. "Yes, remember each other. And whatever happens to you in life, whatever you become, hold on to this truth. There is nothing higher or stronger or more wholesome for life than a good memory, especially a memory from childhood. If we carry such memories with us, we are saved for our whole lives." The boys promised solemnly that they would remember, that they would stay true to each other, that they would carry forward the lessons of love and loyalty they had learned. Then, in a gesture both spontaneous and perfect, they all joined hands around Alyosha, forming a circle of friendship and commitment. "Hurrah for Karamazov!" they shouted, their young voices ringing out across the cemetery, startling birds into flight. Meanwhile, in his prison cell, Dmitri was preparing for his escape. Katerina had arranged everything, bribed guards, secured documents, planned the route to America. Grushenka would go with him into exile, and together they would build a new life far from Russia, far from all the tragedy and passion of the past. Ivan was slowly recovering from his breakdown, though he would never be quite the same. His proud intellect had been humbled, his certainties shattered. But perhaps, in the breaking, he had become more human, more capable of compassion, more open to truths that reason alone could not reach. And Alyosha stood with the boys at Ilyusha's grave, feeling the weight of all that had happened, but also feeling something else, hope. Hope that love was real and lasting. Hope that good memories could sustain people through darkness. Hope that the lessons learned through suffering were not wasted but could be carried forward, transformed into wisdom and compassion. As the sun began to set and the boys reluctantly prepared to leave the cemetery, Alyosha looked at each of them, at Kolya with his fierce intelligence, at the others with their young, open faces, and silently blessed them, praying that they would indeed remember, would stay true, would carry forward into their lives the capacity for love and loyalty they had discovered through knowing Ilyusha. The story ended not with resolution but with continuation, with life going on, with people carrying their memories and their lessons forward, with hope persisting even in the face of tragedy, with love proving itself stronger than death.